still print our stenciled edges. Stained edges are easier to do in the US. Most of our stenciled edges are still printed overseas.
Okay.
Greetings. We're going to go ahead and get started, and I want to first apologize for the delay in getting into this session, but it looks like maybe we are finally ready to go, and so I would like to introduce myself, introduce the people who are going to be talking about publishing from the inside. Couple of housekeeping things. We don't have a chat set up on this session, but we will set up a Q&A, or you can click on the Q&A if you have a question that you'd like to ask. We have some prepared things that we're going to go through first, and then we'll have some Q&A at the end. I'm Karen Trout, and I'm the Community Engagement Librarian at Kalamazoo Public Library. And we're here because of the book Yellowface, which is our Reading Together title for 2024. And presumably, if you're here, you know that already. But publishing figures, as you know, very prominently in this book. And we're pleased to have these representatives of the publishing industry and people who know a little bit more than certainly I do about the publishing industry. So I'm going to start just by telling you who these people are, and then ask them to give you a little more detail about what they do in the publishing industry. Starting with Hannah Bowman, who on my screen is in the lower right. She's a literary agent with Liza Dawson Associates, and more importantly, she is Rebecca Kuang's agent, Rebecca Kuang being the author of Yellowface, and she is joining us from Los Angeles. Then we have Holly Ruck, who is the Director of Field Sales for Macmillan Publishers, joining us from Peoria, Illinois. And then moving around my screen counterclockwise, we have Melissa Weisberg, who is a sales representative with Macmillan Publishers, joining us from Grand Blanc, Michigan. And then we have Amy O'Hanlon, who is a freelance illustrator and a bookseller, and she's joining us from right here in Kalamazoo. So welcome to all of you. Thank you so much for taking some time out to shed some light on this industry that is so prominent in Yellowface. Anna, I'm gonna ask you to start and tell us a little bit about what you do as an agent and what you do in the publishing process.
Absolutely. I think if we think about the life cycle of a book in the traditional publishing industry, I'm sort of at near the start of it here. So as a literary agent, I represent the author in and during the publishing process. So what that means is that authors send books to me. I work for them. All of my clients are authors, and my clients are primarily authors of science fiction and fantasy, although I do some general fiction, such as Yellowface. I do some nonfiction as well. I have a variety of authors on my list, but the author brings their manuscript to me. I fall in love with it, and then I sign them up on my list. We work on developmental edits on the manuscript and prepare it for submission to publishers. Then I kind of steer the entire submission and negotiation process. So I know editors, and we don't have an editor on this panel, but I know mostly people on the editorial side of the major publishing houses. I send the manuscript out to editors at various publishers who I think will be a fit. I negotiate the offers when those offers eventually come in. So then I'm handling kind of the business management side, negotiation, contracts, everything along those lines. Our agency also often handles foreign rights, translation of the book into other languages, sales to other publishers. We work with partners here in LA to handle film and television interest when that comes in, and those deals. So kind of all aspects of deal making in the business side are within what agents do for authors. And then also there's a kind of hands-on editorial, developmental, and strategic component, which I love. So as an agent, I'm, the first person often who edits the book. And then of course the editor steps in and does the editing on the publisher's side. But I'm often involved with my clients in editing further books under contract and being a partner for brainstorming, talking about and planning books and planning, what to write next and kind of how to strategize about their career as a whole. So that's the agent's role in the publishing ecosystem. And the key point to take out of that is that I work for the author, not the publisher.
Very good. Thank you so much. Holly, can you step in and talk a little bit about your role as Director of Field Sales at Macmillan? And I know you and Melissa work together, so I don't know if that makes more sense for you to talk together or separate, but.
We sure can. Hi, I'm Holly Ruck, and as Karen said, I'm the Director of Field Sales at Macmillan Publishers. Macmillan is the 5th largest publisher in the U.S. You probably know us most from textbooks, but we actually have a huge trade side, which are the books that you get in a library or buy at a bookstore. And I oversee a team of 11 sales reps who sell to independently owned bookstores around the country. So we work with close to 2,000 bookstores that are not part of chains or Barnes & Noble. They're the smaller bookstores in your community that sell new and used books. And we are also on our team very involved in the process of the book once it goes from Hannah to the editor and then is ready to start trickling down through sales and marketing. So we offer a lot of feedback we offer cover feedback. We work very closely with our marketing departments on what types of marketing campaigns they'll do. We work with publicity on author events. And our channel that Melissa is part of as well is there to represent the voice of the smaller bookstores across the country.
So I am Melissa Weisberg, and I do work with Holly. I have been in the book industry, publishing industry, I guess, for almost 30 years. First as an independent bookstore owner, and then actually it'll be 20 years next month as a sales rep. And so whereas Hannah is at the beginning, what she does is at the beginning of the process, I feel like I'm really close to the end. What I do is I go into all of my accounts, which are independent bookstores in a large territory, and sell the book that Hannah has bought from the author. Many of them, usually per season. I call on, like in your community in Kalamazoo, I call on BookBug, and this is a bookstore. We generally have about 1,000 titles per season and 3 seasons per year that we represent. And if you've read the book, you kind of understand the process of how the book gets out there. And yeah, I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. Amy, you want to jump in?
Sure. Hi, I'm Amy. I am a bookseller at BookBug, and this is a bookstore. And I'm also an author illustrator for middle grade and picture book titles. I'm pre-published, which means that I am working with my agent to sell the books to the editors and the publishing houses, but we aren't quite there yet. So I'm kind of in the nitty-gritty part, and that's sort of my perspective that I'm bringing today. I don't really have anything else to say, so I guess I'm excited to hear the questions and get started.
Thank you. We're glad to have you join us and to have your perspective in all of this, because, going from what Hannah was talking about as being right there at the birth of the book and you being the person trying to get that book born. So we appreciate that.
The authors do the hard work.
Yeah. Well, I'd say you all do your fair share of hard work. But Hannah, when we all met a few weeks ago, just to sort of outline this, one of the things that we brought up was, can you tell us a little bit about the origin of Yellowface and your reaction to it as an agent, as someone in the industry, and anybody else that wants to chime in on that too? I think we'd all be curious to know.
Well, I'm always interested to hear what other people in the industry think of the book. Rebecca is amazing. Rebecca is a brilliant author with the really fairly unusual ability to write in a lot of different genres, to write on a lot of different subjects really well. And so I had been working with her for several years already when she wrote Yellowface, but we had started working together with The Poppy War, her first book, which is a much more traditional epic fantasy novel. She had then written Babel. We had been working primarily in the fantasy speculative fiction space, and that was where she had published. And then, she came to me with this book that had been just, kind of the book of her heart, right? The book that had been born unexpectedly. She was in the middle of another contract, writing other books, and had written this additional book that she sent me and said, "This is not like anything I've done before, and moreover, it's not like anything you've sold before." So it was really, in many ways, a learning experience for me as well, because Yellowface was my kind of first foray into general fiction, and outside of more genre books, which is where I had historically worked. And she trusted me with this book, and I kind of looked at it and at first said, "Rebecca, I don't quite know how to edit this." And she said, "It's fine, just edit it for plot and tell me how to make the story works, and we'll figure it out together." And I am lucky to have many wonderful colleagues who work in general fiction who were able to help advise me, and to make the connections that needed to be made so that I could feel confident sending it out. But Yellowface in particular is, it's a frightening book to send out to the publishing industry. And I had a little bit of trepidation, not about the story, which was great, and I loved reading the book, but about, what are people going to think when I send them this book, and how will it be received? And, there are anecdotes in Yellowface that cut very close to real things that have happened to a whole variety of real authors. And so for me, there was always a little bit of a sense of, am I going to send this to some editor who sees themselves too closely in something that's said in a bad way? And luckily, Rebecca said, "I'm very dedicated to this book." I said, "All right, I work for you. If you're dedicated to it, I am too, and we're going to send it out." And luckily, it's been, I think, tremendously well received. And if people are offended by it, I haven't heard from them. So that's encouraging.
Thank you.
Interesting. Anybody else have a reaction to it when you first read it, or?
You know what? I didn't know what to expect when, I am a subject of the book industry. I heard all the hoopla when it was published. I'd heard, that it was sort of a satire of the publishing industry, and that it really was very accurate in many ways. So I rushed right out and bought it. Now, it sat on my desk, on my nightstand for a while, because that's what happens when you work for a publisher. It's really hard to read out of house. And so leading up to this is really when I dug in. And my reaction was, well, I loved reading about the publishing industry, the insider stuff. And I thought, this is interesting. I wonder how non-publishing people will react to this and how they find this.
Mhm.
And then, yeah, Junie, anyway, she was, and then Junie. So, but yeah, I mean, as far as the plot and all of the detail, the publishing details, I was fascinated by. It was like,
imagine
seeing how
it
the
would be-
sausage gets made. Yeah.
I was too. I have to say, I wasn't offended by it. My takeaway from it with regards to the interior of the industry was how your perspective of the industry is very different, I think, depending on what department you work in, because there are some conversations that you have more in sales that people don't necessarily have in editorial, but there are things going on in editorial that aren't happening in marketing, that aren't happening in sales. And so I thought a lot about that while I was reading about how your view of this book might be different, one, depending on your age group, and two, depending on what part of the industry you work in and how long you've been in it, which I found that whole thought process was personally really fascinating, because it made me look at myself and go, ooh, where do you land on the scale? So I don't actually know anyone who was offended by it. And I know a lot of people who have read it. I think publishing people, we want to know what we want to know about ourselves. So
It's true. I think there have been so many, I feel like every time there's a high profile publishing scandal, it's like, oh, that's exactly like what happens in Yellowface. And that was happening before the book came out as well. There was the bad art friend, and there was, was it American Dirt? There have been just various scandals, and it's like I see all of those reflected in Yellowface when I look at it, and I think, oh, that's ripped right out of the headlines.
Well, I have to say to that point, so Macmillan is the publisher of American Dirt. And so Melissa and I firsthand lived through that very, very closely. And so it was interesting to read this book, having been through what went on with that in a very close hand experience, and to see kind of the other side of it. So I'm actually glad you mentioned that, because it really, I'm sure it factored into when Melissa was reading it as well.
Mm-hmm.
It did feel really familiar, like the whole Twitter aspect of it, and watching people sort of pile on and catastrophize everything. Like, you don't see it too much in the children's section of book Twitter or anything like that, but you do get aspects of it as a YA and some of the fantasy, and it's so familiar. It felt really, really, almost like, I've already read this story. Yeah.
I read that.
I think when I read it, it was because two of my coworkers had read it before me, and one of them said, like, oh, I don't know if I like it. And so that made me really, really want to read it. And I thought it was really interesting how June is, like, you don't agree with her, and she does all these terrible things, but at the same time, you're in such a close relationship with her when you're reading it that it's hard for you to, like, you feel relief when she gets away with something. And it's like, I felt that was really interesting, because you see things from a distance, and all of these people are saying, oh, this is bad, and without, like, looking at American Dirt critically, you can be like, oh, that book was bad because all these people hated it, without knowing, like, there's another side to this story. So it was kind of cool to see that too.
I read in the Yellowface book club kit that you can find through the publisher that when Rebecca wrote it, it was right in the midst of the pandemic. Is that correct? And so she was noticing, and I quote from this is a Dear Reader letter from Rebecca, saying that people seem to take active glee in ripping each other apart. I know if the internet had become more toxic as a result of I don't know if the internet had become more toxic as a result of our isolation, but I do think interacting with others purely through a screen often leads to downward spirals of paranoia, jealousies, resentments, and willful misinterpretations. So you can see how all of those things are certainly reflected in the book.
That was one of the key things that I thought about when I was reading the book, is how, because we talk about that a lot when we're talking about, what the copy on the book is, and what kind of a social media platform an author has, and what they say, and being very careful, because it is so easy to go after someone if you are not sitting right in front of them. And this book does such a good job of capturing that, and then the spiral that just keeps on going, and how it loops back around, and it just keeps on going. And I think she's really right that the pandemic made that easier in a lot of ways. I think it sucked a lot of people into that behavior that might not have been there before.
Made it almost more acceptable or something. Yeah.
I think it's also really interesting how it now, and I mean, Yellowface only came out, a year ago, but how it is now sort of already feels like very much a book of its time, as something that was written in 2020, or 2021. It's written in 2021, and published in 2023. But that I know we were having a discussion recently for a foreign edition about Twitter, and whether or not Twitter should be updated to X for future editions,
Right.
which it won't be. And that was, very interesting that it was really this moment in like writer Twitter, which was so much the space, the power platform for authors, and is now gone. And really nothing else has replicated both the positive and the negative kind of dynamics of that yet.
Except for the takedown on TikTok now is, whoa, the going after people on TikTok. It's bubbling up in a much bigger way. We've had some things over the past year that have really kind of ripped through the noise. And it's fascinating how one thing steps aside, like Twitter has a bit, and then something else fills in that void, like TikTok is.
So we've touched on this a little bit, but what is it about the publishing industry that reflects these larger societal issues that Rebecca tackles in Yellowface? I mean, as I say, we've sort of started talking about that a little bit, and maybe it has more to do with the pandemic and the isolation than it has to do with publishing, but I'd be curious to know if anybody has any insight in that.
Well, I think it's the same reason that Hollywood likes making movies about making movies, right? I think there's this sense that, media is still so kind of central to how we construct culture. And so that's why book publishing still feels very glamorous, even though, it's not a huge industry, as industries go. But it still feels very glamorous to be in publishing, because it's got this sort of, this is something that's central to our culture and to what we talk about. Yeah. What do? We talk to our friends. We talk about books and TV, right?
Yeah.
And I think it all feels very fraught because it's such a site of cultural formation.
Were there any specific scenarios or characters in the book that resonated with any of you?
In a positive or negative way?
However you want to, yes.
I mean, like we talked about earlier, yes. I mean, reading what happened with June resonated. I mean, it really felt like the whole American Dirt debacle. And there's so many things in there that she said that were right. No bad publicity is publicity, period. Right. And books sell. I mean, despite the horrible things that happened to the author and the publisher, the book just kept selling and selling and selling and selling. And I thought that was fascinating. Because the book by itself, it is a good book. I mean, just like, the Junie's book, it's a great book. And it doesn't matter that there's controversy outside of it. People just want to read. But for me, the end just sticks with me because she's just so delusional and she just can't let it go. And I mean, both times that I read it, I'm like, wow. Yeah, it was a great ending.
I want to talk about the ending, but I don't want to ruin it for anyone who hasn't read it yet.
Oh gosh.
If they're here, I'm sure they know.
There's this part later in the book where she, after everything goes down in a really horrible way with Candace, and she starts to just think about what she's going to do next and how it's going to go. And that to me was so horrifying because it was like, oh my God, you're perpetuating and you're just going and you learned nothing and you got nothing from this. And that, I shut the book and I thought about that. I still think about it actually. It's been weeks. And it's just because it was just such a just such a, you went through absolutely all of this pain and suffering that you really brought on yourself, but also that other people fed into, and in the end, you're just doing the same thing again and didn't learn the lesson. So that particularly stuck with me.
Anybody else?
I thought I really connected to Robin in Babel because he is half Asian and he has this issue where he's sort of being raised in the society that sort of hurting his own home. And so when I was going into Yellowface, it sort of hit me like a slap. Like, it just surprised me how unsympathetic June is, and the microaggressions that were really insidious, that she sort of would say as if they were fact. And it was I related to it in a way where I didn't, when I was growing up, I didn't realize that people were giving me microaggressions or telling me things that they'd be like, oh, you're really pretty because you're half Asian, you're exotic, but not too exotic. And so I related to it in recognizing, like, she has no idea that what she's doing is being offensive. And I think that was something that really connected me to the story, was that Rebecca was able to, she was able to write some things that you could see were her own experience, but like flipped and backwards. So that was really cool for me.
Great. Thank you. Well, I know there is one question already that has been posted. I think at this point, we'll go ahead and open it up for other questions, but the first one is to you specifically, Hannah, asking if you plan to accept queries in the near future for YA fantasy.
I don't accept queries for YA anymore at all, and I do not currently have plans to reopen, which I know is a disappointment to a lot of people, but I had a baby last year and I'm still catching up.
Yeah. Very good. If you do have other questions, you can type them into the click on the Q&A button at the top of the screen and type in your questions there.
I have a question for Hannah.
Yeah.
Actually, do you have a favorite part of the book or something that really stuck out to you? I mean,
so that's a hard question for me, because there are a number of parts of the book that make me laugh because they are verbatim from experiences I have had, and I can't name which parts they are. There is at least one line in there that is something I said. I'll let you all figure out which one it is. So, I always really enjoy that stuff, even when, as an agent giving professional advice, it makes me a little bit nervous. And I think, well, should you tone that down? I think for me, the thing that makes the book just so deliciously, horrifyingly wonderful to read is June's voice, and her just the way that Rebecca portrays her as so monstrous and clueless, and yet she's so compelling that you can't stop reading, and you kind of feel bad for her, except you really shouldn't feel bad for her. That was the thing that I just thought was fantastic.
Isn't that like the classic anti-hero? I mean, you just can't.
I love an anti-hero. I was so excited when Rebecca first sent me the Poppy War. I was so excited because those books are really, I'd always wanted a big villain tragedy, like a how did I, a Faustian, how did I become the villain kind of story. Mm-hmm. And that's really, in my mind, what those books are doing. They're really a tragedy of that kind. So I love an anti-hero, and I don't think June is quite an anti-hero. Not in the same way as an anti-hero usually has a little bit more well-intentioned, but I think there's a similar sort of reading a sympathetic villain is similarly appealing.
She definitely was one of those characters that as the whole book, I thought, oh, I can't stand you. You're horrible. But then, oh gosh, oh, you just cringe and you think, oh, I want to help you, but oh, you're horrible. But oh, I want to help you. Yeah.
In a lot of the book discussions that I've attended in the last couple of months about this book, the word cringe comes up a lot.
There's a lot of cringe. Yes, there is. She just can't help stepping in it. It's unbelievable.
And it's so anxiety provoking to read, the internet's falling on her head and she just keeps making it worse, Or that I always find particularly cringeworthy the scene where she goes to the Chinese group at the church that's
Yes.
invited her. And it's
Mhm.
so, I mean, it's just so painful to
So
watch.
bad.
Mhm.
I feel, and she's being so horrible.
Yeah,
Yes.
she really was.
I feel so sorry for them,
We have another question from Chris. From Industry Inside Experience, how important is a social media presence to a writer? And is it starting to present a possible threat to success at this point? You sort of touched on that a little bit, talking about X and TikTok.
I mean, I think it matters more for nonfiction than fiction still, and always has. Platform matters a lot for nonfiction, and with fiction, you can kind of build it as you go. If the book is good, publishers don't expect a huge following. I think, it's not obvious how social media sells books, particularly anymore. Being in conversation with people seems to help build word of mouth a little bit. There is the potential for something terrible and horrible going on, and we see those stories of virality, but it's you keep on engaging and do your best.
I think a lot of it too depends. I agree with what Hannah said, and a lot of it depends on what you're writing and who your intended audience is. And
Yes.
that's why it works really well for nonfiction. I think it's working really well for a number of the romantasy authors who really want to engage in the bookish community that has the same interest of yours. But the best social media platforms for an author are the ones that are not forced. If that's not your jam and it's not who you are, that becomes very obvious very quickly to your readers, and then it doesn't do you any good. And so I think, yeah.
And I think it's about building community. And so it's like where you find your people, because I know, like, we're talking about TikTok and Book Talk, which has become actually a big driver of sales. Like, Book Talk is driving sales in a way that I think other social media platforms aren't, but it's all very organic. And my sense has been that Book Talk folks are very allergic to things that seem like they're being forced by authors or publishers. And if you try to, make yourself go viral on Book Talk, they're going to hate you. And so it's much sort of, it has to happen organically. And I think all of social media for authors, really, it's like all you can do is just talk to people like they're people, right? And be in the places where you can find your people. And then it's true, like if you're in that community and it's working, I think that really does make a difference. But trying to sell, people see through it.
Makes me think of Becoming Duchess Goldblatt. Is anyone familiar with that one, about the anonymous author that creates an alter ego on Twitter?
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, here's another question for Hannah from Sam. I just visited your website. As a fellow Cornell alum who's no longer in science, I'm curious how you transitioned from particle physics research to a career as a literary agent.
Yeah, well, so my particle physics experience was very minimal, and it was in high school, and it's because my dad was a particle physicist.
Okay.
So I'm a Nepo baby. But I went into college thinking I was going to be a math major, and I came out of college as a math and English double major, but doing much more on the English side. And I came out of college with an English major, not knowing what I was going to do with it, except that, I'd seen when the book publishing editor and the agent came to visit Cornell, and I thought, oh, well, maybe I could be an editor, but I don't think I would want to be an agent. I don't think I would be good at sales. And then I was unemployed for a while because it was 2009 and there were no jobs. And as I started to try my hand at writing, and I'm not a good novelist, and realized I was much more interested in pitching novels than I was in writing novels, I sort of found myself working my way around to an internship on the agency side and got very lucky to be connected early on with Liza, and I've been at the company ever since. So I fell into publishing on the agenting side from the beginning, and it turned out to be very much the right fit.
Okay, sorry, there is a question here from Jade for Hannah. Did Rebecca formally query Yellowface with a letter? And how is querying or selling satire to publishers different from other genres?
Right. So a couple things. So no, Rebecca didn't query me with Yellowface because we were already working together at that point. So Rebecca queried me for the first time in 2015 with the Poppy War, which was the first book that she had written for publication. And so that's when she came to me. Once she was working with me, we worked together on developing future books, and it's an ongoing relationship between author and agent. And so there was no query that came to me. I did write a letter when I sent it to publishers. And so when I send a book out to publishers, I will generally send them the manuscript, but I write a cover letter for the manuscript as well, and do put quite a bit of care and thought into those, partly because often, it's interesting. Once a bit of copy has gotten associated with a book, it sticks with it. And so I have seen things from my letters that end up, I don't remember what's happened with Yellowface, but I've seen things from my letters end up on the back covers of books. And I've seen things I've taken from authors' original query letters because I like them and they've gone all the way through the process and ended up on the back of the books, if it's the right description, right? Sometimes they're changed, sometimes they get kept, but there is always that sort of contextualizing of what is it you're gonna share with people, and what do you want them to know about this book. And so I did that in my letter for Yellowface when I sent it out. Obviously, Rebecca had an excellent track record in publishing at that point, and we were not selling Yellowface really as a satire. So the question of how do you sell a satire specifically, I think it's really a work of general fiction, and it works as a novel. And part of why I think it works so well is because it has a very compelling thriller plot, really, that works on top of the satire. Because if it were just satirizing publishing, I don't think it would have found the readership it did. So I sold it I sent it to general fiction editors as a general fiction novel that was a new direction for this already popular author.
All right. Are there any other questions from our attendees? I saw a hand up a minute ago and then it went down. I don't know if you're able to type in your question in the Q&A. And Melissa, were you going to say something?
I have one more question about Rebecca for Hannah. I'm sorry. I think did you say you have one more general fiction book from her under contract, or did Morrow buy this book and another one?
Morrow has bought another general fiction book. Okay. Yes,
that's great.
I think that's been announced. I can talk about that.
Okay.
Yes, it's still a few years out. So her current next book is Catabasis, which is coming from Harper Voyager in 2025. So which is a more speculative novel. So that will be the next one, and then she is working on the books after that.
Awesome. Cool.
We were talking about anticipating questions about Rebecca, and yet Rebecca will be here in Kalamazoo on Saturday, March 23rd. So I just point that out. If anybody doesn't know that, we'll be able to ask her some questions ourselves, hopefully. There is another question here from Chris. Outside of the query process, what is the best way for new writers to break in or take advantage of local libraries / professionals, such as those on this panel?
I mean, so in terms of publishing a book, right, I think the query process does work. And I know that it is stressful for authors. I really am a believer in query letters. And maybe you were getting that when I was talking about the letters I write to pitch, because I find query letters a helpful way of contextualizing a book. I find that they're helpful for authors. And Amy, maybe you should speak to this because you've done this as a way of making sense of what the book is about, right? And of really making sure you know, here's what my book is and here's who's going to read it and here's how it fits in the market. And I think that's what you can really get maybe from, you know, librarians and publishing professionals, is a sense of what is it, not that you need to find things exactly like your book, but what is it you like to read and where is it you want your book to fit in with what you like to read. And it can be bizarre and off the wall, because there are a lot of bizarre and off the wall books and I represent many of them because I love stuff like that. But like, where what's the reading experience that you're going for, I think, is a helpful question. But I'm going to pass it to Amy.
Yeah, so besides query letters, I do agree. I think those are the most important things, because it forces you to sort of look at your own writing and say, like, okay, what is the absolute essence of it? And I think a lot of the times when you've been working on this project for months and months and months, you sort of don't realize, like, oh, I don't know what the story is in 2 sentences. So that's really helpful. And then it's a great way to go and meet an agent, is to send it to them. But there's also, you know, lots of opportunities where you can have like an editor look at your work. There's competitions that you can find, or conferences. I do children's, so I am part of SCWI, which is the Society of Children's Book Writers and Illustrators. I got my agent by going to a conference and winning the illustrator panel. So yeah, I think just making sure you are aware of what the industry is like and finding the opportunities where you can have more direct involvement with them. That's also a really good opportunity to get in contact with potential future agents.
Karen, you're muted.
Thank you. Any other pointers on what makes a query letter compelling?
So in my experience, when a query letter doesn't work, it's usually because something isn't working in the story more than because something isn't working in the query letter. And I know that authors really worry that they're going to have their book be misrepresented by a bad query letter. But my experience has been that if you can tell a compelling story in 200 plus pages, you can tell a compelling story in 200 words. And if you can't tell that story in 200 words, I don't trust that you're going to be able to tell it over 200 pages. And I wish, you know, that's not 100% correlation, but I've read a lot of queries and a lot of manuscripts, and it tends to bear out. The things that work, I know from the very beginning, I'm really excited about this query letter. And sometimes the letter works and the book, for whatever reason, does not hold up. Right. But it's very rare for it to go the other way, because I think the key to a good query letter is to understand the book that you're pitching, right? And to understand what the story is, and to figure out what are the specific things that you love about that book and fit them in. Not in a like cramming every detail in, but it's so much about, if you look, and I think I'm sure Holly and Melissa have this experience when they're selling books as well, right? That it's so much about the specificity of like, what's the thing that makes this book stand out? We talked in Yellowface a lot about June's voice, and that being something that's so compelling that you've got to get across, because so often, like, query letters, and usually it's out of books by the time it gets to copy or sales documents. Usually they're better than this, but so often there's this sort of sameness to it, right? Of, oh, this feels exactly like everything else this person has seen. This feels exactly like everything this bookseller has seen this season. There's nothing new here. And so even if the stories are similar, because lots of times stories in a genre are similar, it's pulling out like, what's that thing that makes this book stand out from the others on the shelf in the reading experience.
Thank you,
I totally
Hannah.
agree with that. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, it's okay.
We talk about that a lot in sales, about how when we sell how it's this meets this meets this. And because we always say your reader is already out there, like they're reading something. So what is it that they're reading, and why would they want to take that next step to what you're doing and to this book? And so it's pulling out that kernel and that exact right combination that, so that when you're talking about it, it hits and you go, oh, I get what you're trying to say. It's this vibe, it's this tone, it's this specific thing that makes it unique.
So I think to use Yellowface as an example, I think we got a ton of mileage from the title Yellowface, which was something that Rebecca and I landed on before we sent it out to publishers, because it so clearly expresses both many of the tensions in the story, but also the tone and this sort of, this slightly transgressive feeling of the voice, I think is carried in the title. And I think a good title can really do that for you, right? And a title is a sales document in the same way. And pitching, it's all about that. It's about what's that little bit. I will always remember when Rebecca first queried me with the Poppy War, the two lines I always remember was there was a line, because it has this shamanism, right, where they use drugs to enhance their magical potential. And she had this parenthetical in the line, get high, breathe fire. And that just stuck with me as carrying there's something really special going on in this book, right? That, and combined with the fact that this is the history of 20th century China in epic fantasy. And those two things, I read those and I thought, oh, this book is going to be a hit, right? So it's getting to like pulling out the things that are really special about the reading experience, rather than like getting tied up in, well, it's like this book and this part of the plot and this book and this other part and this meets this. It's more about that, like, what's that one thing that's going to stick with the reader?
Thank you. Jade asks, why did Rebecca choose to use her full name for Yellowface instead of her pen name? What it suggested?
I don't remember all the details of that discussion. There was a long discussion, and ultimately I think it came down to being a question about new genre. And, for authors, there's often discussion about what, how I'm sure sales consulted on it actually about, how is this going to communicate to the intended readership? Do we want to set it apart as a separate genre? Do we want to be sure to emphasize that she is a female author in order to reach that readership? Those are the kinds of questions that go into it. I don't remember the specific discussion.
Candace has another question.
That's what to think about, because
go ahead.
Oh, I was just gonna say that I feel like I listen to a lot of people talk about like Asian authors who are married to white men, or half Asian people, and probably other races too. But we're always discussing like, oh, do I use my mother's maiden name because it's not going to be recognized as an Asian person writing this story, and so it's funny to think about it for like, oh, do I use Rebecca versus R.F. Kuang because it's a book about women, and like that's it's part of the nitty-gritty of publishing, I guess.
First floor restrooms will remain open.
Excuse us, our closing announcement is going on our PA system.
Oh no.
You're muted
Talk
again.
amongst yourselves. No, here's another question from Candace, and then maybe we'll wrap things up. In your experience, what is key to a close author and agent relationship / what do you tend to look for in an author?
I think that can vary depending on the agent and the author. I think being able to find a communication style that works for both of you is really important, and people talk about that a lot. And I would say, I'm very blunt. My communication style is very blunt. I tend to do better with authors who resonate with that, because I have had, without naming names, but I have had conversations with authors where I have had to call them on the phone and say, this book that you just turned in is not publishable. You have to start over. and was able to do that, and they agreed with me because of the ongoing trust that had been built up over the years of that relationship, and I think also because we had been working together in that way well enough that I could say that, right? And so, there are like anything else, it's a question of finding fit and of figuring out, am I going to be able to, as an author, hear feedback in the way that this person presents it? Is that going to work for me? And if it's not, then somebody else is a better fit, So I think that's probably the biggest thing. And then there's the question of just, do we love the same kinds of stories, right? Fundamentally, I take on books that I love. And so there are certain tropes and ways of writing and things that I just really resonate with. And that's extremely subjective. So I think there's also that it's really wonderful when you're working with an author where it really feels like we have that layer of trust that we can, that they trust me to look out for their career, and I trust them that I can be honest about how I feel about the book and they're not going to fire me. And also that there's that level of like, oh, when we talk about these things, it's really fruitful and productive because they love the things about their writing that I also love.
Thank you, Hannah. I'm going to go ahead and post a link to a really brief survey, and then we have one final question. I just don't want to forget to share this. It's just for our sake here at the library so that we can plan accordingly. A final question, though, from Chris, and this would be for all of you. If you could change or alter one thing about the publishing industry, what would that be?
How slow it is, maybe? It can be very slow. Like, if you are waiting for edits for a story, sometimes it can take 3 months, and then your due date's in 3 weeks, and you have to take that into account and really, really hurry up once, So I feel like it's really slow.
I probably complain a little bit about it, but I honestly love the publishing industry. I've been in it for 30 years from both sides, from being a bookseller to selling books to booksellers. And there's so much that's great about it because reading, learning new ideas and expanding what you read because of what we do is wonderful. I just love it. So
I'm going to give an extremely boring answer. That's only it's only because it's a space I'm currently living in with work. And this answer would change tomorrow probably, but today I would change the pricing structure that we have to use to price books, because it's really, really challenging. The cost of paper and shipping and printing and all of the things that go into making a book. It's not cheap, and it's a low margin industry, and I would change that because I love books. I want everyone to love books. I want everyone to have books, and I wish that books could cost less than they do. So that's my boring technical answer.
I have two answers. And one is the thing that I think probably most urgently needs to change, which is that there are very real issues of equity around race and class that have been raised recently, both in terms of employees of publishers, like who's able to work for a publisher, who's able to be an agent, because it's very difficult to get started as an agent, and you often, if you work on commission, do not make a lot of money for the first several years, which restricts the pool of who can do it, and to a certain extent, who's able to afford to be an author. So that's my serious answer is, how do we increase authors of color, authors who aren't authors and publishing professionals who aren't upper middle class white ladies in New York. You know, what do we do to make the industry better in that way? I think most literary agent possible answer is that I wish authors got paid more. And I think that, you know, it is very hard to make a living wage working as an author. And there are structural reasons for that. It is, as Holly says, a low margin industry, but you know, boy, I'd like authors to get more money.
I feel that way about sales reps. I always say nobody goes into this industry to get wealthy.
That is true.
Well, on that note, I would like to thank all of you for your time this evening and all of you who attended and listened in and asked your questions. I hope that this was informative for you. I know it was for me. I don't really know anything about the publishing industry, and it was enlightening to hear your conversation and learn more about it. And with that, I think we'll be able to sign off, and thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank
Thank
you.
you so much.
Yeah.